The Other Side Podcast, Episode 5. All right, welcome back to The Other Side. This is episode 5. Hope you guys are all having a great weekend wherever you're at. We are enjoying some beautiful weather here in central Indiana today after a couple of weeks of some really miserable rain, some really bad rains and flooding and stuff. And today's just been an absolutely gorgeous day. So I hope you're having a great weekend. Shout out to all the mothers out there this Mother's Day weekend as well. Thank you for all you guys do, all your hard work and effort. So I'm in a little bit of a transition period right here. I know I presented an episode to you about a week and a half ago now. Currently, personally, we're moving from one house to another, so we're in a transition right now. But have no fear, I am at the computer. I'm not ensconced behind the golden EIB microphone, and I'm not in the basement of a nondescript building. Shout out to the Rush Limbaugh, Mark Levin fans out there that might get that reference. But like I said, I am set up shop here, ready to go, locked and loaded. Got the second half of our look at why I am a libertarian, which is a counter to the article that I took us through last time, written by Nathan Schuleter from the from the Imaginative Conservative, entitled "Why I'm Not a Libertarian." It was a defense of conservatism as a political ideology. And I just want to kind of, as a real quick refresh before I jump back into this, is to kind of set the groundwork for understanding. I had a conversation with one of my coworkers the other day, who listened to the podcast, and he said, "Yeah, I really liked how you made mention of the fact that libertarianism is not a perfect ideology." And I just want to re-emphasize that again, that as I go through this, I am not making the claim that libertarianism is perfect. There are many flaws I see personally in libertarianism. But I think that the central tenets of what it stands for and how it could be potentially applied in action are far superior to that of conservatism and certainly the liberal ideology that the modern Democrat Party offers here in America. So having said that, again, I want to keep that kind of framework as I go through and critique this piece. And as we look at some of these different things, I know there are some holes in libertarianism, but I think all in all, as I examine it more, I just come around more and more to understanding and aligning with what it presents. So our main takeaways from last time were just kind of understanding a little bit of the sense that what libertarianism has to offer as an ideology. It's one that basically relies on personal freedom, and with that freedom comes responsibility. And I think that's kind of the sticking point. Sometimes we can get caught up in the minutia of what this means or what that means, and I do think it's important to define what terms and definitions mean. But I think overall, when you look at stacking up libertarianism against conservatism or liberalism, that it does offer the best solution to what we are facing here in America today, which is on either side, whether you have a R next to your name or a D next to your name, it's the system. And I'll talk a little bit about this as I go through the second half of my critique today, is that, those that are going to the polls every 2 or 4 years and voting and hoping and coping with the outcome it does not matter, guys. It's the machine, it's the system, it's Leviathan, it's all the tentacles of the national government and state governments that are increasingly more and more taking away liberties and freedoms. And once those are gone, they're so incredibly difficult to get back. A and B, you forget what it's like. I always tell my students to think about flying. Now, most of my students were born about 2000, 1999, so seniors, right? Were born in around that age. And so they're living their life post 9/11. And I didn't fly all that much prior to 9/11, but I did fly a couple of times in my childhood, and I do have memories of what airports look like prior to 9/11. And when you analyze and look at, where airports are today and what is going on, it's not difficult to understand why we're in the mess that we're in and why we basically give everything up in the name of, security, and we're worried about terrorism. And, I just have a very, very difficult time wrapping my mind around that. But at any rate, I think that's kind of the basis for what we were looking at here, is understanding what libertarianism has to offer, what it's built off of, this idea of freedom and responsibility, and how you let the society, the market, choose and select what to do. And you're going to hear that theme again today. So we're going to pick up with number 6 here on the list. And remember, what he's done here in his piece is he's made a list of claims by libertarians, and then he kind of deconstructs it a little bit from the conservative viewpoint. So he picks up here with this statement: virtue cannot be coerced, therefore government should not legislate morality. And he starts off by saying coercive law cannot make people virtuous. So at least he admits that. I'll give him credit for that. But then he comes right back to saying, but it can assist or thwart individuals in making themselves virtuous. Law is both coercive and expressive. Not only does it shape behavior by attaching to it penalties or rewards, it also helps shape attitudes, understanding, and character. And I would stop with what he said right from the get-go. Coercive law cannot make people virtuous. I always tell my students, and I encourage you to think about this as well, when I say, why is it that you do not go around and violate people's property? Why do you not steal private property from other people? Why do you not harm another individual? And I very, very rarely get people to say, well, because it's against the law. Now, I think somewhere in there it is, kind of thought, oh, okay, well, yeah, I could get in trouble with the law. But that's not the impetus for why you don't take that action. You, as an individual, probably do not commit those atrocities or those actions because it's ingrained in you as a moral teaching, in whether that comes from your family and friends or the local community that you're a part of, a church, some type of organization that you've been a part of. Those teachings, those inherent teachings and understanding, and it's natural within ourselves to not want to do that because we don't want that for ourselves, right? And so the fact that, there are laws on the books that would punish me if I were to steal from somebody or physically accost somebody, yeah, I guess in a way you could say, that is on my mind as I choose whether or not to commit those acts or not. But that's not what prevents me or stops me from doing that. That's an inherent thing that I've learned in the moral teaching in my community, right? And so as a parent, I'm hoping to instill that into my children. If I go to my children and say, okay, I'm going to teach you guys something. There's this thing called stealing. And if you steal, I will take a ruler and I will wrap your knuckles with it. Or if you take something from somebody else, I will paddle you. Now, they might go, whoa, okay, I don't want that. But again, at the end of the day, that's not what's going to stop them. I mean, if that was the case, then there would be no crimes ever committed in society because laws apply to all people in society. So I have a little bit of a hard time wrapping my mind around that. And this is really where I go completely vehemently disagree with him on this. He says, libertarians who doubt this point can examine the difference in attitudes toward racial discrimination in America before and after the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I honestly don't really quite understand what he's trying to accomplish with that statement. I don't understand how he views or interprets American history, because I don't think that is a fair or accurate statement at all, to think that Americans' views drastically changed as a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I think much of what went on in the South, and my understanding and interpretation of it, was done at the end of a gun. It was done by the force of the national government going into the South and going into other cities in America and basically mandating that these things were going to happen. These things were not going to happen naturally. They were not going to happen because, unfortunately, people were learning them through virtuous teachings, right? It was done by the point of gun. Now, I would love to say that people would wake up and understand that, the ways that they were behaving prior to 1964 were, grossly unacceptable. But the reality of the situation is that, and we see this still today in various different places, that people still have this inferiority complex, that, there is racism in America, and that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 has not wholly eradicate that, and I would argue that it hasn't been a huge impact in that. Now, again, that's not to say that it hasn't had some impact. To what degree that is, I don't know, honestly. I can't tell you that, but I do know that people's attitudes have not wholly changed on that. He even brings up some other examples here where he says the availability of pornographic materials before and after Roth versus U.S. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I hear a lot in the church about how pornography is ruining people's lives, and you see these stories that come out every now and then about how much of a big business that is. And again, I don't know that court ruling has done much about that, and even this last thing that he brings up here, where he talks about stability of marriage before and after the introduction of no-fault divorce laws in the 1970s. The law, both by prohibition and by silence, is a powerful signal of acceptable behavior and thus a powerful influence on character. I vehemently disagree with that. I mean, our justice system is overloaded with people that commit offenses against the law. So the law in of itself, while it might be virtue signaling, isn't necessarily going to alter people's behavior. So I'm just not quite sure that I get around to that there. All right, number 7, government should not interfere in the free market. Absolutely, right? I agree with that. That is a statement that I think libertarians would make. He says because they oppose commerce in things that are intrinsically immoral and harmful, such as hard drugs, prostitution, or obscene materials, conservatives are accused by libertarians of opposing the free market. I don't know that I've ever heard a libertarian claim that a conservative is against the free market. He says conservatives value the free market as much as libertarians as a means for mutually beneficial exchanges, as an occasion for the exercise of virtues such as creativity, cooperation, industry, honesty, and thrift. So he wants to define, which again goes back to what I mentioned earlier, that what most people think of when they put their hope and faith in the government is that, if we could just get the right guys elected in office, right, they'll be able to make government work for good. They'll be able to set the tone for the market to provide an exchange of creativity and industry and honesty and thrift, but that just does not happen, as I'll explain here in just a little bit. He says conservatives oppose the total market in which all human associations, such as families and churches, are falsely remade in the image of ordinary contracts, and in which all voluntary, short of force or fraud, contracts between consenting adults are enforced by law. That's not necessarily true or wholly accurate there, the way that is being described. My understanding of what the free market would look like is you let people determine what is mutually beneficial, and then if contracts are enforced or not enforced, right, that's up to the two parties to decide on that, and that they should be able to take action against somebody who would not hold up to their end of the bargain. There again, though, not needing a law officer to be able to, that is mandated by the government, to enforce that. I am currently going through the sale of my home right now, and I can tell you the number of things that we have to attest to and sign to, and all these hoops that we have to jump through for the federal government are just unbelievable, and they add just a huge burden to the cost of what we're doing. And so again, I think when people like this, like conservatives today, claim the free market, and they think of it in the way that it should operate. The problem with this is that then the free market gets muddied, right? It gets a bad name because this isn't free market. This is crony capitalism, what we have today, and it's giving the free market and capitalism a very, very bad name. And so again, when you get to just pick and choose and decide what you think is right or what you think the market should be doing based on what the government at that point in time says it is, that's where you get in trouble. Okay. All right. Number 8, the only alternative to libertarianism is totalitarianism. So again, basically this kind of sense that, if we don't have libertarianism, then anything is living under a totalitarian government, right? Like a dictatorship. And I've seen this idea expressed more and more by libertarians, and I kind of am starting to come around on this. Now, I'm not a zero gov person, don't get me wrong. I think there is a role for very, very limited government in our society, but I do not see the way that our current system is set up in America as a positive way. So I think I do take a little bit of exception with this. He says this is a false dilemma. He says between the fantasies of libertarianism and totalitarianism is the wide spectrum of governments that have actually existed throughout most of human history. The false dilemma is often associated with the slippery slope fallacy. If people are given the power to coerce in one area, they will eventually coerce in all areas. And I absolutely agree with this. I think if you look at the results of modern governments post-Enlightenment, you will see they have been the single largest organization that's committed atrocities against people the world over. And so, again, you want to look at Hitler's Germany or Mussolini in Italy, or even throughout the United States history, you will find that governments have committed grave misdeeds against civil liberties and freedoms. And so I think that, by using that example of somewhere in between libertarian and totalitarianism, there is this wide swath or spectrum of governments that are actually working. I just disagree with that based on the record of history. As I got into an argument with some guy on Twitter earlier this week, you can look at the history books that will dictate that. All right, number 9, libertarianism is based upon a realistic understanding of human nature. He says libertarians accuse conservatives of being utopian or naive about human nature. Self-regarding actions are sufficient for producing a free and prosperous society, they argue. Moreover, power, by its very nature, corrupts human beings and therefore should be narrowly circumscribed and vigilantly watched. And here again, I would absolutely encourage you to take a look at Benjamin Franklin's speech at the Constitutional Convention. He has a phenomenal speech where he highlights this, talking about the creation of the president as the head of the executive branch. He talks about the issues of power and money in attaining a position like the presidency, and take a look at what that has done to the United States over the history of this country. The millions and millions of dollars that get spent every 4 years to obtain this position. Why? Why are people so willing and able to spend so much money, even if it's other people's money, right? And why are other people willing to donate so much money to get the, quote, right person in office? What are they doing that for? Are they doing that for the best interest of the country? Are they doing that for the best interest of themselves, of their organization that they're a part of, right? Franklin's got a wonderful speech that I really highly encourage you to read through. It's not very long, and you can find it just by Googling his name and Constitutional Convention speech, and I'm sure you'll find it's one of many that he delivered during that period of time. All right, and so he goes on to talk a little bit more, the author of the article, about the whole idea of what Madison wrote in Federalist 55, which is basically saying kind of what we're getting to in looking at Locke and Hobbes, man in the state of nature. Basically, Madison says, look, if you've got man in the state of nature, I'd rather have a government of limited government of a Republican form than having, no government at all. And he's right to a degree. But there again, I take us into modern American politics, and I would say, as I mentioned earlier, there's not much of a difference between those that have a D next to their name and those that have an R next to their name. You're really getting the same results, just taking a different path to get there, okay? He finally says in this part, public virtue alone is not sufficient to secure limited government, but it's foolish to think that it can be dispensed with altogether. If despotism of George III caused the American Revolution, the virtue of George Washington was necessary to conclude it. The aim of every political constitution, Madison wrote in Federalist 57, is first to obtain for rulers men who possess most wisdom to discern. And this is another misstep I think many people make on this topic. Ladies and gentlemen, our politicians are not the smartest men in the room. They're not, and it's not the smartest women in the room either. We like to see them and put them up on a pedestal. Even our founding fathers. I have a lot of issues with Madison. I tend to look at Madison and I look at the Virginia plan and I kind of shake my head and I say, what did you think was going to happen with this? Now, he did come around to see that there were some issues with what would become the modern government. Him and Jefferson both wrote some great things toward the end of their political careers to kind of correct some of the things that the government was already starting to do in terms of overtaking powers and things of that nature. But again, if you're putting your trust into a political system that you think is just going to get, if we can just get the right pieces into the puzzle, it's a pipe dream. It's a utopia. You can criticize libertarians who call for limited government, utopians or looking for, the ideal situation, but I don't see it any different with what we have today. All right, finally, number 10, freedom works, right? It's that simple. Freedom works. He says this is a frequent refrain of Hayek, but what does it mean? Well, it means simply that when we are left alone to make up our own choices and our own decisions in the local areas that we live, right? The towns, the communities, the organizations that we're a part of, when we are not being coerced by the national government or state government or local government to do various different things, then the best result is going to happen. It's that simple. Anytime that you have government regulation or government interference, you are not going to get the desired outcome that you want, irregardless of the people that are working the gears of the machine. He says weapons also work, though not necessarily for good. Well, yeah, you would be very wise to take a look at the modern Republican Party and the conservative part of that party, and they are war hawks. They are constantly calling for spreading democracy at the point of a gun, and you need to look no further than the endless war that we've been in the Middle East over the last, say 30 or 40 years, right? And so, again, I don't know, and that's government run, right? That's all in the name of spreading democracy and stopping the spread of terrorism, but what result is it getting us, okay? And so he kind of wraps up with this. He says, there is a liberty of corrupt nature which is affected by men and beasts to do what they list, and this liberty is inconsistent with authority. Impatient of all restraint by this liberty, we are all inferior. 'Tis the grand enemy of truth and peace, but there is a civil, a moral, a federal liberty, which is the proper end and object of its authority. So again, he's saying that as long as government can provide you your liberty and freedom, then you should love your government. You should want your government. And my counter to that is, I don't think government can properly do that. I think only the free market and being left alone and the individual spirit for people to be able to associate with one another the way that they want will lead to the proper outcome. Okay, so again, that kind of wraps that up, and I think it's a great lead-in into what we're going to be looking at coming up in our next episode. I think we're going to try to do a joint episode between Mr. Margison and myself. And by the way, if you did not get a chance to listen to his first podcast, I highly encourage you to jump back in and give that a listen to. It was a great piece on basic economic theory using healthcare and why we can't have free healthcare. I thought he did a fantastic job of putting it into basic economic terms and getting, hopefully, you to think a little bit beyond the talking points that you hear in the media and by politicians that are self-interested in looking for re-election. And he and I had a conversation one time about, he said, well, hey, have you ever thought about the social contract? And I said, oh, yeah, absolutely. I've heard I've thought about that. I teach the social contract. As I mentioned earlier, I talk about Hobbes and Locke and man in the state of nature and what would it look like if there was no government, right? Essentially anarchy. And, obviously you can get a number of different responses from that. You can get people who will say, oh, yeah, that'd be fantastic. Be left alone, be able to do what we want, forge our own outcome. And then you get people who say, oh, no, more like a Hobbesian. Oh, no, we need a government, a strong central government to make sure that we're not killing each other and stealing from one another. And then you got Locke, right, that says, oh, maybe we have this thing called the social contract, right, where essentially you kind of say, well, I'm willing to give up some of my liberty and freedom to the government in order to be protected. And I go back to that airport analogy that I used earlier. Or things like stop and frisk, right, by the police that, yeah, I'm ready, I'm willing and able to be detained for a short period of time for an officer to be able to do a quick sweep on me, check, hey, you got any weapons on you, boom, you're on your way. And people don't think anything of that. They think it creates a safer environment, right? But there's a couple of issues with that, okay? And then also, too, along with that, there's this idea of consent. A contract requires consent. And so who said, hey, I'm okay with the federal government forcibly taking 40 to 50% of my earned income, right? And I'm okay with the government being able to do A, B, or C, right? And when did I ever consent to that? And I think a lot of people are starting to wake up to questioning some of that. And so this leads into Hans Hermann Hoppe's piece that I'm reading through right now. I just finished it up. I'm going back through a second reading of it more intently. It's a shorter piece called What Must Be Done. And the reason I really like this piece is it's solutions oriented. He doesn't just rail on modern government and, oh, woe is me and lament over it. He says, look, here's the problem, right? But here's what can be done. Or what must be done, actually. So I really like what I've read through here. I'm going to use that as the cornerstone, along with another piece that kind of focuses in on what the ideal state would look like, right? What would it be? And it basically boils down to this: think local, act local. Which is a very important thing that we need to recapture. We need to quit looking to D.C. To be our savior. We need to quit looking to our state capitals to be our savior. There are so many things that we can be doing on a very small local level that I want to really try to encourage people to think like that. And so I'm going to use those two pieces as a framework to address that with Mr. Margison and kind of talk a little bit about the social contract theory and what modern governments have become and what we can do to potentially correct some of the atrocities that we see going on in our society today. So that's going to wrap it up for looking at why I am a libertarian. And again, I want to just emphasize one more time that, I do not see libertarianism as the end-all be-all. I do not see it as the wholly perfect ideology politically. It does have some holes in it, but by and large, I think the core tenets of it are what provide us with what this country was founded on. And I just want to encourage you to think about that, right? Go back and look in your history books and think about what were you taught about the American Revolution, right? What's the one catchphrase? I got my father-in-law coming in here with me. What do you think of when you think of, the American Revolution? What is it? What's the phrase that you... Right, exactly right. He's saying no taxation without representation. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And so, you think about that, right? And that's the battle cry. That's what we always heard is no taxation without representation. Well, first off, I want to say, how's representation working out for you? How's taxation with representation working out first? Second, when you think back to, and this, I think Rothbard does a great job with this, Murray Rothbard, Hoppe does a great job with this as well, talking about monopolies, right? And the federal government having a monopoly over these things, over protection and over taxation and providing social programs and things like that. What has that created? That's what we rebelled from. All right, when you look at the actual tax programs that the Crown was putting, the taxes weren't really all that bad. It wasn't the taxes, right? It was the manner in which it was being done. It was a force. There was no option in the market, right? It was the grants of exclusivity on the East Indian Tea Company and all these other ways and methods in which the Crown was giving out monopolies for products in this country, and the prices and the lack of competition. And so we're going to talk a lot about what that does, right, when that happens. And so that's what we're going to wrap up with here today and what we're going to pick up with next time. Again, I encourage you, if you want to do a little bit of working ahead on that, reading into that, certainly take a look at what was going on in America, colonial America, and thinking a little bit about what this country rebelled from. So again, I want to thank you for taking time to listen today. I hope you found it entertaining and enlightening. Please feel free to continue on the conversation with us. I've had some great feedback from some people on Facebook. Certainly, I'm willing to take the conversation out there on Twitter. Also, remember, you can email us directly at margisonandspears@gmail.com. And again, thanks for listening. And remember, your education is not complete until you've heard the other side.